I'm going to give a brief presentation.
I think here it is. So I just have a message saying that we're going to be streamed, and I'm being asked whether
Meeting is now streaming. Okay.
That's right. So we're going to be streaming on YouTube. The YouTube it will be for our general viewers.
Yeah.
And after the Johan's signal, I'm going to give just a brief presentation about all of you, and then I will give the word to our moderator, that it will be Alejandro.
Okay.
So Alejandro will coordinate times and the order of words and so on.
Okay.
Okay. So,
very good.
Johan, so we are ready, I think. So prepare everything and just give us the start.
Okay, we can start.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. So it is a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thanks to all the people that is watching us right now. We are here to present the Professor Willaschek's book about Kant. We are celebrating in the Universidad Nacional de Colombia our tricentenary because the birth of Kant. So I'm going to present our guest. Our guest is today. I'm going to start with saying thanks to Professor Fabiola Rivera Castro. She's a doctor from Harvard University. She is a researcher in the Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas in Mexico, and she's also a professor, philosophy professor in the UNAM. We have also the presence of Professor Pedro Stepanenko Gutierrez, who is a doctor from UNAM, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and he also works as a researcher in the Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas and is also professor in the UNAM and other universities. As a Colombian quote, we have Gonzalo Serrano Escayón, who is a doctor from Universidad Nacional de Colombia and magister from the Boston College. He has been professor in the Universidad Nacional de Colombia for over 30 years, and he's also a researcher and a translator. And we have Professor Alejandro Rosas. He is doctor from the Universitat Münster. He has been professor in the Universidad Nacional de Colombia for over 30 years. And he is our organizer for what join us today. And obviously we have our special guest, that is Professor Marcus Willaschek, who is a doctor from Universitat Münster. He's now professor in the Goethe Universität Frankfurt am Main, and is the author of the book that join us today, the Revoution des denkes. So I want to say thank you also to SPEC, Seminario Permanente de Estudios Kantianos, that makes this possible, because they are helping us with the stream and with this realization. I want to say thank you also to the SILEC in the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, and the groups, and the researching groups, Dialéctica y Modos Geométricos and Ética, Comportamiento y Evolución, that are researching groups in the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. So today, our moderator, it will be Professor Alejandro Rosas. So I want to say thank you to all of you. And I just give the word to our organizer and moderator. So thank you to all of you and Professor Alejandro.
Thank you, Robert. Welcome, everybody. and welcome very especially Marcus Willaschek. Thank you, Marcus, for attending and for accepting this invitation. We are going to talk about his book, Kant, die Revolution des Denkens, Kant, the Revolution of Thought. I must mention that this book was nominated for the German Nonfiction Prize in 2024. It's a very special book in many ways, especially because not only he presents, gives a complete presentation of Kant's philosophy, but it also places the book in the context, the historical context of his work, and tells a lot of facts and anecdotes about Kant himself. And I think he wants also to sort of debunk some myths that have been circulating about Kant's life. So first of all, I want to give the word to Marcus. Marcus, tell us a little bit about when did you conceive the idea of writing this book in this way, and how long have you been working on it?
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everyone, for participating. It's a great pleasure to be here and to discuss my book with you, and I'm really grateful for that. This book, Alejandro, you have asked me how long it has taken me to write, and in some sense, it took me 30 years to write. Alejandro and I, we were students, doctoral students together in Münster, and I think I couldn't have written that book if I hadn't learned from so many people over so many decades about Kant. But then, given the fact that I've been studying Kant's work for more than 30 years now, maybe more than 35, I guess, it went surprisingly quickly to write the book. And the reason is that the book is not meant, of course, for you guys here who participate in our discussion. So this is not a book for Kant specialists. It's a book for the wider audience. And my aim was to try to explain some Kantian ideas to people who are not professional philosophers. And what I found when I started writing the book is that the challenge in doing that is not so much the content, because the content, that's on a level where, well, I mean, for me, I know Kant's philosophy, I've known it for such a long time that it's not so difficult for me to explain the fundamental ideas in epistemology or ethics in Kant. The problem is to do it in a way that people don't get bored, that they don't find it boring or somehow or too complicated. And I must say, I so much enjoyed writing the book. I've never written a book that was so much fun to write as this one. So I really enjoyed doing it. And the plan came up. So I had in the back of my mind the idea of writing a book for the wider audience for the Kant anniversary this year, for 2024, Kant's 300th birthday. But then, luckily, the publisher, C.H. Beck, who is one of the major publishers for non-fiction books in Germany, they approached me and asked me whether I wanted to do something with them for the Kant year. But this was already in like 2020 or maybe 2019. And so I wrote a brief expose of the book, and then it went back and forth. And in this process, I came up with the idea of not writing a chronological or thematic or thematically ordered presentation of Kant's book, so that you perhaps would start with the critique of pure reason, and then the critique of practical reason, and then the critique of judgment or something, but rather to try to write it in 30 brief chapters. And every chapter has a topic. And in every chapter, I try to convey some of Kant's more abstract philosophical ideas, and in some sense to sugarcoat it with historical anecdotes, so that for a wider audience, it's possible to take this in without getting bored. And the order of the book is not following the order of Kant's thought, but rather I try to start with those topics that are most accessible to the general public. And already when I first thought about the book, I decided to start with the chapter on peace, even though this was long before the Ukraine war and now the war in Palestine and Israel. Because I felt that this is a topic many people feel strongly about, and where Kant has important things to say. And so from there, from peace to history to education, ethics, I work my way to the more abstract and metaphysical and epistemological parts of Kant's thinking. So that's how the book came into existence, and I finished it. So I wrote it basically in. Hardly dare to say this, but I think the writing of the main body of the text took me only half a year. But then, as everyone who's written a book knows, there's another year of work in doing fitting in the references, proofreading, and everything. So it was maybe half a year of concentrated writing, and then one more year which I worked on the book until it was done.
Thank you, Marcus. I might comment that this joy that you felt writing the book is really obvious for the reader. You know, it comes very fluid, and one senses that the writer somehow has all the content already in his mind and can explain it and describe it in a sort of in a row. So it's very interesting really to read it, and we of course understand that the book is not written for experts, but nonetheless one cannot avoid making some claims when one writes a book of this nature, and one has not the opportunity or the possibility to in detail explain the claims and support them. So this is like an opportunity to talk a little bit about these claims, and maybe, because I hope the book will have many editions, it's like a book that is written so that it will have many editions. You will have to rework some things, and maybe these sort of events where you discuss with people will give you the chance to change some things, add maybe things you didn't really consider putting in the book. So that's the idea of this event, and we have prepared a list of topics, and I will share them so that the audience can have them in sight as we discuss them. I will share them through the Zoom, and then we will start discussing with the most general topics to the most specific, maybe. So let me see. Share screen. I don't see, do I have a possibility of sharing here?
Yes, Professor.
Yes. Okay. Nonetheless, screens. Okay, let me see. Yeah, funny because I cannot, it seems I cannot share my, here, PowerPoint. Okay.
Good.
Now you are seeing it, yes?
Yes.
Fine. So
Professor, excuse me, you are mute.
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Now, the first topic is about presenting Kant to a wide reading audience, and there may be some dangers or difficulties doing this. There are trade-offs, how one does this, and so I will ask Pedro to help me now put this question or this topic in words and in conversation with you. So Pedro, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. First of all, I would like to say congratulations to Marcus Willaschek for this book. I read some chapters and I really enjoyed them. And yes, I recognize this effort to make closer Kant's philosophy to a wide public. And I remember some introductions to Kant's philosophy, and most of them start explaining what is transcendental philosophy, which is the methodology, and obviously explain the third, the critics, the first, the second, and the third. And you decided, as you have said, another way to expound Kant's philosophy. But at some point, I am thinking on the chapter on enlightenment. And at some point, when you say, well, Kant didn't criticize enough his own ideas, because look what he said about women and what he said about different races and what he said. You didn't say something about non-human animals there, but you could say it. My concern was, well, the problem to introduce in this way Kant's philosophy is make believe to this wide audience that philosophy could be a question of opinion and not to argue following certain principles and well, that everybody can make philosophy just talking with his friends. So I know that you make also an effort to avoid that, but I would like to hear how you avoid this danger.
Well, thank you very much for your question, which is really a very important one, particularly since there is a tendency, and I think that's in the background of your question, in the wider public to see philosophy as just a matter of opinion. And I don't know whether you have in the back of your mind, when you ask your question, Hegel's famous criticism of the history of philosophy as just being about people's beliefs. Of course, I think that there is really a danger there that people think that the history of philosophy consists in Plato saying one thing, Aristotle saying another thing, Thomas Aquinas saying the next thing, and people don't understand that what really counts is the arguments people give for their views, and that we all, in doing philosophy, try to get closer to the truth. And of course, this can get lost if you just present people's opinions. So I completely share your concern here. On the other hand, of course, this is a book about Kant and his philosophy. And now, I want to say something you may find slightly shocking. I don't think of myself as a Kantian. I'm a Kant scholar and a philosopher. And in my own philosophy, I share some of Kant's views, but I do not share many others. There's, for instance, when it comes to Kant's epistemology, and I think we're also later going to talk about, for instance, Kant's transcendental idealism and stuff like that, I'm completely critical of that. I don't think that we should follow Kant here. Of course, I think that Kant has very interesting things to say, things worth that we think hard about them. But in the end, I don't agree with Kant. And so if you don't agree with someone and you still want to present their ideas, in some sense, you necessarily end up presenting their opinions. You say, this is what Kant said, bracket, even though I don't believe he's right. And so what you do, you present to people Kant's views, and as I think in the book, I try to be not overly critical of Kant, because of course I want to convey to people how interesting Kant is. But I think that in many places I make clear that that Kant's views not only on women and race and other politically contested subjects, but also his views in epistemology, at least some of them, some of his views in ethics, some of his views in his philosophy of nature are views I don't share, and I at least indicate what the reasons for this. And this takes me to the final part of my answer. I think the way to, on the one hand, criticize Kant and thereby conveying it's only his opinion and not necessarily the truth, but still conveying also that philosophy is about truth and argument, is to explain your reasons why you agree or you disagree with, in this case, with Kant as the author I'm trying to explain. And so the idea is that the readers understand, okay, here is someone writing a book about Kant. He takes Kant's philosophy seriously. And how does he do it? He does it in the way Kant wants us to take it seriously. He is critical of it and has critical arguments back and forth with Kant, so to speak. I hope that all in all, maybe one more thing. Something I emphasize throughout the book is Kant's point that you cannot learn philosophy, but only philosophizing. And that philosophy consists in the process of really thinking things through for yourself. And I hope that this is something I convey in the book, that that's what philosophy is about.
Yeah. Can I say something?
Of course, Pedro, go on.
Well, yes, I agree with you that we cannot follow all Kant's ideas. But it is very important, and I think that you made it in your book to distinguish those ideas that follow from his principles and from his argumentation, and other ideas that are not grounded and supported by his main principles. And I think that race, women, and non-human animals, well, non-human animals is different, but his opinions about race and women are not derived from these principles. And I think it's worth to stress this difference. And well, yes, I agree with you that it is important to introduce philosophy, well, discussing topics and giving reasons for one position and the other, no? But it is very important to say, well, these ideas follow from the principles we can discuss the principles, but these are well-grounded and these other are not well-grounded. You say something about prejudice in this chapter on enlightenment, and I would like to hear something about that, because that was a topic that he teaches in his logic lectures. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think I now understand better the point you want to raise in your question. I want to respond by saying, yes, there are then perhaps three levels here. On the one hand, there is Kant's philosophy and what Kant wrote and what he taught. And now within that, we can distinguish on the one hand between what is essential to his philosophy, what, as you say, follows from his principles, and what perhaps does not.
Okay.
I emphasized another distinction, namely the distinction between what Kant himself thought and what we today find convincing, or what I, as one person today, finds convincing. And of course, these two distinctions, they can overlap in complicated ways. And so for me, I would go so far and say at least some of the things that follow from Kant's own principles and that are essential parts of his philosophy are claims that I don't find convincing, where I think that Kant's argument just doesn't work. For instance, let me just give you one very brief example. I think that Kant's argument for transcendental idealism, the claim that empirical objects are not things in themselves, but only appearances. I think the argument in the end rests on the idea that we have synthetic judgments a priori in mathematics and in the foundations of the sciences. Without that claim, I think Kant's argument just doesn't work. So he, particularly for space, he needs the synthetic and a priori character of geometry for his argument. And today, I think we don't have much reason to believe that geometry is synthetic a priori. And particularly, we don't have reason to believe that to believe that Euclidean geometry is the geometry of physical space. But without that assumption, I think, we can't go into the details here, but I think without that assumption, Kant's most fundamental claim in his theoretical philosophy doesn't get off the ground, namely transcendental idealism. So I'm very critical of that, even though it is something that does follow from Kant's own principles. And on the other hand, we have those views where Kant says things where you might claim that these are not following from the principles of his philosophy, but are reflecting mere prejudices of his time. And that would be claims about perhaps race or women or homosexuality, suicide, and other things. Now, I think this is a very, very complicated issue because, as you know, there are people who claim, at least for the issue of race, that Kant's theory of the human races and his distinction, his hierarchy of races is not an accident. It's not only a prejudice, but rather something that is a central part of his wider conception of philosophy. Xue Lu Adler in her book has made that argument. Now, I'm not convinced by that. So I wouldn't say that Kant's philosophy is somehow essentially racist. But then, on the other hand, one has to admit, I think, that it's not mere prejudice, because Kant, as you can see in his articles on human race, he puts much theoretical effort in defending his view. He has a very complicated pseudo natural science proto-genetic theory of the races. And so I would not say that it is a completely accidental part of his work that does not belong to his philosophy, strictly speaking. So I wouldn't want to go that far. Maybe it's different with his what he says about women. Maybe that's really just prejudice and nothing more. But when it comes to racism, I think this goes a bit deeper than mere prejudice.
So thank you very much for the answer. I think that we have now a wider view of your approach. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Marcus and Pedro. At this point, if one of the people present, like Gonzalo or Fabiola, wants to make some comment, you can make it. So.
I think that we should move to other questions because we have already half an hour. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So the second point is the Copernican revolution. And Gonzalo, you can please present this point and the question. And Pedro also had some issues there. So Pedro, you can, after Gonzalo, you can also contribute. Gonzalo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Alejandro. First of all, I have to congratulate Professor Willaschek. I didn't know about the prize. Really, it's very pleasant for you to get this prize, and I congratulate you. And I'm very pleased also.
If I very quickly may say, in the end, I didn't get the prize, but it was a nomination, so I was a finalist among the final 8 books of the year. But that was I was very satisfied with that. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. But I am very pleased also that you choose the character, the revolutionary character of Kant's thought as the title of the book. I don't think that's ironical. I don't think so. I think it's serious. And my concern is how to understand this Kantian revolution. There is no a single answer to this question. This revolutionary character is very complex in Kant, is very multivarious, is in several things, several aspects of human life and philosophy. But I am concerned specifically in the Copernican character of Kantian thought. The Copernican character of the revolution of Kant's thought related most of all to epistemological problems. And I am also conscious that the book is for the wider audience, but I have seen that lots of Kantians do not understand the deep of this analogy Kant proposed with Copernicus. And then they are like, they lead lectures, readers, they lead them into misunderstandings. And one of them is the one the one misunderstanding that characterizes Kant as subjectivist, as anthropocentrist, and in the words of Russell, as contra-revolutionary and as Ptolemaic, if you remember this quotation of Russell. Then I think this is not a minor question, nor a specialized thing, what means Copernicus for Kant. And I have something, maybe I am obsessed with Copernicus, and I have to confess that, I am obsessed with Copernicus. But I was reading the book, the biography, the Manfred Kuhn's great biography of Kant, and he also emphasizes in the revolutionary character of Kant, but I hadn't found not even one mention of Copernicus and the character of his revolutionary thought as Copernican. And I think that's very shocking. That shocked me. I have to confess, but I say I am obsessed with Copernicus. Then I would like to know how to evaluate this controversial character of the role of Copernicus in Kantian thought. This is a first formulation of my question.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much for your question, and I'm aware that it is an important topic. It's a complicated topic. So let me first quickly say how I understand Kant's analogy with Copernicus in the Critique of Pure Reason. And you can then say whether you agree with this or not. I think the way the analogy works is this. As Kant sees it, the great insight of Copernicus was to understand that the movements of the stars and the planets in the night sky are the result of really two kinds of things. Namely, on the one hand, the self-motion of these celestic bodies, and on the other hand, the fact that the observer also moves on the Earth. And so what he found out is that the zigzagging motions, for instance, the planets make in the night sky, they seem to go one way and then again another way, that this is not reflecting the real movement of the planets, but rather it reflects the way the movement of the planets must necessarily appear to an observer who moves on the Earth around its own axis. So that's the point of the analogy. It's a point about saying, if we reflect on the perspective of the observer, we can explain how things necessarily will appear. And I think Kant wants to say something analogous about empirical reality. If we take into account the perspective of the human observer, which for Kant means the perspective of someone with the forms of intuition, space and time, then we can explain how empirical reality will necessarily appear to the observer. That's, I understand the point of the analogy. Would you agree with that, or do you have a different?
I agree completely with you. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm glad
Yes.
that you agree on this.
This is a right. I will say way of correlate Copernicus with Kant with the text of the Copernicus himself.
Yeah.
And it's not a matter of heliocentrismus and geocentrismus and this thing that profilates in also in a lot of introductions to Kant. Then my second level of the question would be, how can we prolong this analogy to achieve a comprehension of the transcendental? And that's I can explain myself better. How depending is this interpretation of the privilege of the human nature, as in astronomy, the privilege of the human or the terraquian observer? Is there any privilege in this relation, or the idea is that in Copernicus we have a rule to observe the universe that applies for every planet in the solar system? Then Kant would be someone who study the rule that makes possible the objective knowledge of human nature as it would be possible by the same rule, but to other rational non-human beings. Can we prolong this analogy to this way of explaining transcendental perspectives? It's a little bit what I'm telling to you.
No, I mean, that's of course a very interesting, but also a very complicated question. So, I mean, first of all, when it comes to the question of, what does the Copernican analogy, how does it play out with transcendental philosophy? And I think the way I have tried to explain the analogy, the point of reference is the necessity in saying this is how the night sky must appear to someone from that perspective. And I think Kant wants to say something analogous about the workings of our cognitive capacities. Given those cognitive capacities we have, there's a kind of necessity claim that the world must appear in a particular way. And this necessity claim transfers then to the statutes of geometry, the statutes of causal principles, and so on. So the necessity and objectivity and validity of transcendental principles in Kant's philosophy derives from the necessity of the way the world must appear to beings like us. So that's how I understand how this analogy transfers. Now, you've asked, if I understood you correctly, whether there is a privilege here to the human perspective. And I mean, I'm not sure whether we are already on the second point on the slide. Is this because there are these, and you mentioned before the problem of subjectivism and anthropocentrism, and I think that it's not correct to claim that Kant falls back into a Ptolemaic perspective in placing the human being, as I say in one formulation, at the center of the world, because what is important to understand is what often today is called Kantian humility. The world that in the center of which the human being is placed is only an appearance. It's not the world of things in themselves. And so there is nothing, no hybris or no anthropocentrism in a bad sense in this claim. I think a different way of saying that Kant placed the human being in the center of the world would be a different way of, in a way of bringing out the humility in this claim, is to say that the world in which human beings live is only the world as it appears to them, and not the world of things in themselves. So this is the big difference to the kind of view Russell, for instance, attributed to Kant. Russell thought that Kant was saying only, well, the world is there for human beings and they construct it and they're in the center of it. But that's, of course, only half of what Kant wants to say. Because the other half is, well, the world, the empirical world that we can understand in the terms of transcendental philosophy is not the world of things in themselves, but only an appearance for human beings. And maybe, and you asked about other rational beings, I mean, Kant himself says that space is only a human form of intuition, but I think this is an overstatement, because Kant cannot know that there are not other finite rational beings who have the same kind of form of intuition. So I think what Kant should have said is that it's only the way the world appears to beings like us. And it's an empirical question whether perhaps on other planets there are rational beings who have the same forms of intuitions that we do or not. And I think Kant and the philosophy cannot say anything about this, whether this is the case or not. It's an empirical question. I hope this somewhat answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Pedro has something to add.
Well, yes, my point was a minor one, a minor point. And well, the Copernican revolution is a metaphor. And, you know, when you have a metaphor, you need to specify the feature that works in this metaphor. And I think that there is this Russell's misunderstanding is induced because one can think on the position of the Earth instead of the movement of the Earth. And the metaphor works only if one thinks on the movement of the Earth, because the movement of the Earth is what explains the apparent movement of stars and planets. But if you think on the position, well, you could say, well, actually Kant was a neo-Ptolemaic, and in this sense, a counter-revolutionary. And that was the point. I mean, it's important to stress that the metaphor works with movement and not with position. And I think that you, in page 20, in a very short explanation says that das menschliche Subjekt in den Mittelpunkt der Welt zu stellen, can induce to this misunderstanding. Of course, you in 26, you explains better the metaphor, talking about movement. That was my point in
okay, but
reference to pages.
I think I understand your point, but would it help to say that center of the world, in das Zentrum seiner Welt, I didn't intend this to be read spatially. This was not meant the spatial center. It was a center in a, as you say, metaphoric sense. So it's because but I understand that this is maybe misleading. So I didn't want to say, of course, that Kant placed the human subject in the middle of space. Of course, that's not the point. Rather, it places the human subject at the center of the empirical world in the sense that every feature of the empirical world is imbued with or is structured by human forms of cognition. And in this sense, it's more an abstract sense of center here. The human being is in the center, not in the same sense in which the Earth, according to the Ptolemaic system, is in the center of the universe. Of course, that's not what I wanted to say. But thank you for making me clarify this. Thank you.
Yes, and I think that's related with the concept of necessity, because in the categories of modality, when Kant expound modality, it is clear that he is talking about epistemic modality and not what today would be metaphysical or ontological modality. I mean, it is clear that possibility is concerned with what we know at some point, what we have evidence in when we say that something exists, and necessity when we understand that things cannot be another way. And that is epistemic modality and not ontological, because there is a criticism against Kant saying, well, if we cannot say that things are necessarily only because we cannot conceive them in other way. So we should make the difference between epistemic modality and ontological or metaphysical modality, something that Kant didn't make. No.
Yes, I'm not an expert on Kant's theory of modality, but it seems to me that even though Kant maybe was not very explicit about drawing the distinction between epistemic and metaphysical modality, I would think that the modal categories, they are meant to be not only epistemic, but rather metaphysical or ontological, in the same sense in which, let's say, the relational categories also are not merely epistemic. I mean, Kant wants to say something about the structure of the empirical world. He wants to say that causation is something that happens in the empirical world, even though the empirical world, of course, according to Kant, is only an appearance. And I think the same thing is true about modality. So when Kant says what is possible is what is compatible with the possibility of experience, and what is actual is what really conforms with the forms of experience, and what is necessary is what is a condition of experience. When he says things about like that, I don't think that he wants to say something only about epistemic possibility. I would have thought it's meant because it's a category. So even though Kant says it doesn't contribute to the content of the judgment, still he wants to say something about possibility in the world and not only about epistemic possibility. But I mean, as I said, I'm not really an expert on that point. It's very complicated. But my hunch would be to say no, it's really meant to be metaphysical possibility.
Yes, I agree. It is meant to be metaphysical, but that's a critical point against Kant, I would say. It's a tricky point. Yeah. I agree.
Okay, but now I understand you better. So you want to say Kant wants us to give an account of metaphysical modalities, but because of the transcendental framework, so to speak, he doesn't succeed in doing that because it's only epistemic. Is that what you want to say?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, I think you're right, or at least I think that there's a very serious point. As I said before, I'm myself not at all convinced with Kant's transcendental idealism. And so I think that's one of the points in which one can be critical of transcendental idealism, at least in the official form Kant himself presents his view. Yes, I agree.
Exactly. Well.
Okay, if I may say something about this formulation, place the human subject at the center of the world, even if that is the phenomenal world, one could think that is a bit too strong, because there are things about the phenomenal world that still remain mysterious in natural science. But more importantly, the future of humanity in Kant is, it's like a thing of hope. It's an issue of hope. There's no certainty, there's uncertainty there. And so if we were really the center of the world, even the phenomenal world, I think this shouldn't be so. This shouldn't happen, but it happens. So maybe we are not really at the center of the phenomenal world.
Yes. Okay. I now become aware of the fact how misleading, or at least how many possible interpretations this sentence can have, and maybe I should really try to find another way of making my point. I would have thought that this rather abstract sense in which Kant places the human subject in the center of the world would not rule out that there are contingent features of the world that we do not control. I mean, what I wanted to say, and maybe this is I should have said that and not what I really said, is that according to Kant, there is no feature of the empirical world that does not, in one way or another, reflect the way human beings are cognitively equipped and the way the world appears to beings like us. So that there is nothing we could point to in the empirical world that would be completely independent from our own cognitive perspective. That's what I wanted to say. And of course, you're right to say that, well, placing the human subject in the center of the world is overstating that point. Okay, good. Thank you. And I look at that passage again and I think about revising it. I mean, in some sense, this returns us to the point we talked about first. How do you write for a wider audience? And of course, you need catchy phrases for a wider audience. But catchy phrases are always, it's always very easy to misinterpret them, to overinterpret. And so I think, so to put it differently, my hope would be that the average reader of the book will understand this phrase places the human subject in the center of the world, not only by looking at that one sentence, but by understanding the context. And so they will understand that what is meant by it is the way in which the world cognitively depends on our makeup. And I'm not sure. I'd be thankful for your suggestions here. I mean, do you think one should avoid these kinds of formulations, or is it okay as long as the context provides a more nuanced account, so that the reader can understand what is being meant, even though the phrase itself may be misunderstandable? I mean, I'm really torn here. So thank you for pointing this out to me.
Yeah, no problem, because I hope your book will have many editions and you will find also catchy phrases that may avoid, some misunderstandings. Probably not everybody will misunderstand, but some could. So
Or
good.
could be perhaps more than correcting something, it would be better to warn. There is these two kinds of formulate the metaphor and be careful.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And if I remember correctly, I don't do it in the book. I could have mentioned the Russell
Yes.
form.
Yeah.
And then said,
Yes,
no,
because that is at the very beginning of his book on human knowledge and its limits. That sounds a little Kantian, no? Knowledge and limits of knowledge, and it is at the very introduction of the first page, I think so.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think so that would be, of course, helpful to explicitly mention that possible misunderstanding and then rule it out and say, no, this is not what Kant meant.
No.
Fine. Okay, so we can go advance to the next point. And this is a point about the primacy of praxis over theory and how one can understand it and how Kant understood it. And Pedro, can you please help us with this point?
Well, very shortly, because I would like to hear Fabiola and also practical philosophy. The point is, yes, you stress from the very beginning that practical philosophy and practical concerns are the main concern of Kant. But at some point, I think that when I was reading the chapter of the limits of knowledge or something like that, you mentioned that reason looks always for something unconditional. And I think, I thought, well, that's a theoretical point. The idea of reason as looking for something unconditional, that's something theoretical. So it seems to me a little paradoxical that the theoretical philosophy have a principle that gives to practical philosophy the main concern, because practical philosophy or practical reason can satisfy this yearn for unconditional, this point of, and so I think it's a little paradoxical that the theoretical reason explains why practical reason is the main point for philosophy.
Yes, I see your point, and I think so. The most relevant passage for that is the passage on the primacy of the pure practical reason over speculative reason in the critique of practical reason, where Kant in the end argues for the postulates of pure practical reasons, where he says that even though we don't have theoretical proof of God's existence and we don't have theoretical proof of in eternal soul, we can postulate these things. Now the argument does not go in the way you have just suggested. Kant does not say, well, in theoretical respect, for instance, we aim at the unconditioned. The only absolutely unconditioned thing would be God. And therefore, we require from practical reason to give us somehow an argument, or it's for practical reasons that we believe in God's existence. Rather, the argument goes the other way around, because Kant thinks that theoretical reason as such in itself must follow a principle that today would be called evidentialism. Evidentialism in, for instance, David Hume's sense, and also in the sense people use that term in epistemology today, which is the claim that without sufficient evidence, it would be irrational to believe something. And evidence would be what is now called truth conducive. So it would be reasons that indicate that the belief is true. And of course, practical considerations in this sense are not evidence, because they don't argue for the claim that the belief is true. All they do is they claim, they show that the claim is somehow practically important. And so Kant thinks that when we only look at theoretical reason, we wouldn't, even though theoretical reason wants to cognize the unconditioned, given that we cannot cognize the unconditioned, we would have to remain neutral. We would have to say, well, we don't know whether God exists or God does not exist, and that's all theoretical reason can say in this. But then Kant argues there comes practical reason, and there comes the fact that we do have an unconditional moral principle, and that this unconditional moral principle requires of us to realize the highest good. But then we recognize that in order to be able to realize the highest good, we must believe that God exists and that our soul is immortal. So it's only this indirect way that, according to Kant, then justifies us in making claims about the unconditioned. So for Kant, it's not going from the theoretical to the practical, but rather from the practical to the theoretical. I'm not sure whether this helps. Is this kind of an answer to your question?
Well, in the way you explain it, I think that you are saying, well, precisely because the theoretical reason cannot answer and must remain impartial when it doesn't have enough evidence, precisely because, like in the antinomies, you must suspend judgment. Yes. Precisely because we reach to this point, and the reason still wants to have something unconditional to understand, not to know, but to understand, and that's when practical reason comes. There is the will, there is the freedom, there is the responsibility, answerability that we need to take into account now. So in some sense, I think that you are introducing practical reason, appealing to the failure of theoretical reason. I mean, the failure of theoretical reason is what gives place to the practical reason.
Yes, yes, I think
not concerning knowledge, obviously, but concerning how to guide our life.
Yes, I mean, I think we agree here. Of course, Kant very famously says in the B edition of the First Critique, I had to restrict knowledge in order to make room for faith. And exactly. So it's the restricting. So the theoretical side does nothing more than to acknowledge its limits.
Exactly.
And then, because there are these limits, because theoretical reason as such cannot provide us with the unconditioned, then it's possible for practical reason to fill this gap, so to speak.
Exactly.
But if we would imagine we were beings only with theoretical reason, without practical reason, and without moral principles, we would be mere spectators, so to speak, in the world who theorize about it. Then we would not get at the unconditioned. We would not get what only the postulates or practical reason can give us, according to Kant. This is how he sees it. And I think just on a different note here, I think that this is one of the most attractive features of Kant's philosophy. I mean, I'm not at all a fan of his argument for the postulates of God and immortality. I don't think that these work. But the general idea to say that we are both theoretical and practical beings, and what we rationally ought to believe can not only reflect theoretical reason, but must also reflect practical reason. I think that's a very deep and interesting idea that is still relevant today.
Okay. No, that's right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we can now go to
Can I
the
add something?
topics of. You want to ask something about this? Okay, Fabiola, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, hi, Marcus.
Hi.
Hi,
Thank you for
everyone.
being
I'm not sure I'm agreeing with what you are saying. I'm not sure because I think I see the point of what you're saying, but on the other hand, you both of you, Pedro and Marcus, but on the other hand, practical reason starts the search for the unconditioned from itself also.
Yes.
So it's not as if the search for the unconditioned is only a matter for theoretical reason, but practical reason searches for the unconditioned on its own terms. So the concepts in practical, the central concepts of practical reason are the concepts of good and evil. So the search for unconditional goodness is something that is proper to practical reason. So what I'm saying is, it's not just the business of theoretical reason to search for the unconditioned, also practical reason. When you act, and well, this is not exactly what Kant says, the way I'm going to put it. It's a way of putting it. So when you act and you search for the justification of your actions, or when you say that something is good and ask whether it is good in itself or good conditionally, or so then you start the search for an unconditioned, for the unconditioned, which is reached with the categorical imperative, as Marcus just mentioned. But the justification or the search for unconditional goodness is not dependent in any way on theoretical reason. So it's parallel to theoretical reason. And so if we agree with this, I'm not sure whether we can agree with what Pedro was saying. I'm not sure. I just wanted...
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I think this is a different angle on a point I had been trying to make before. I think the direction of justification here goes from the practical to the theoretical. And this means that already so if I just said if we were merely theoretical creatures, we wouldn't get at the unconditioned. And I should have added, and now you have added very correctly, that if we were purely practical creatures, if that was possible, we would aim for the unconditioned, and we would first of all ask for the unconditionally good. And I think Kant comes very close to saying what you just said in the opening paragraph of the section on the highest good in the Critique of Practical Reason, where he says that reason, as on the theoretical side, also on the practical side, always aims for the condition of the conditioned and thereby for the unconditioned. And now we ask for the condition of the conditionally good, and that's in the end turns out to be the highest good. And in some sense, this is something that is something unconditioned, completely on the practical side, so to speak. But now comes the complicated move Kant makes. He wants to say that merely for practical reasons, we can understand that we have to aim for something that is unconditionally good. But now the complicated thing is that in order to be able to do that, we also have to postulate something unconditioned on the theoretical side, namely the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, which are not practical claims, but these are existence claims. God exists, an immortal soul exists. That's a theoretical claim. And Kant wants to say, because reason strives for the unconditioned on the practical side, we also have to assume something unconditioned on the theoretical side. So that's the interesting move Kant is making here. But I completely agree with you that the interest in the unconditioned does not come from the theoretical side. It's on both. So reason, and I think, so it's both on the theoretical and the practical side. And I think that the deeper reason for that is that in the end, according to Kant, it's only one reason. Reason, both on the theoretical and the practical side, is human reason. And it has on every level the same kind of structure in that it strives for conditions for the conditioned and thereby for the unconditioned.
Yeah, may I say something? Yeah, well, I agree completely that we don't need theoretical reason in order to have imperatives and to feel the imperatives. So practical reason doesn't need a theoretical reason. That's absolutely clear, and I agree. But to understand these imperatives as related to this search for something unconditional seems to me to be something theoretical. I mean, remember the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason. That seems to me something theoretical, a tragedy of the reason that cannot answer, things that cannot avoid to question. That seems to me something theoretical, and the practical reason comes to satisfy this search for something unconditional. I agree that imperatives and responsibility and all the practical stuff works without the theoretical, but the interpretation of the practical reason as the satisfaction of this search for something unconditional, I think that this is theoretical.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Fabiola here, that I think something is missing from your picture. And what is missing is the fact that, particularly in the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant also works with the concept of the object of practical reason, which is the good. And he thinks that the same dynamic of starting with something that is conditioned, and then you ask for its conditions, and then for its conditions, and that takes you to the conception of something unconditioned. The same dynamic you find in theoretical reason, you also find already in practical reason, in the search for something that is unconditionally good. So I think what we have to distinguish here is the categorical imperative, which is unconditional, and the highest good, which is an object of pure practical reason, which is unconditioned. And I think going from the categorical imperative to the unconditionally good object, the object that is good and includes everything that is good, that's a move Kant locates already in practical reason itself. So it's not merely theoretical reason, it's also already practical reason that has this kind of dynamic in itself. Is this, Fabiola, would you agree?
Yes, that's what I was trying to say. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Touché.
No, but I mean, it's just an addition to what you have been saying, and I mean, not many people, I think, look at these passages in the Critique of Practical Reason. People read the first 30-40 pages, and then they read the stuff about the postulates, but there's stuff going on in between, and not many people notice this. And so I think the impression, Pedro, you have is one many people share, that it's really all this kind of thing, and you may know about this whole literature on the supreme principle of pure reason in the first critique, and people think that this is a purely theoretical thing in Kant. And I think it's not many people notice that there's also something similar going on the practical side.
Okay.
So you're not in in good company.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we can go to discuss particular topics of Kant's practical philosophy, starting with what we could call Kant's liberalism. And Fabiola, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for your book. I enjoyed very much reading it. And I want to take this opportunity to ask you on these questions that are, that matter to me, which is the way in which Kant's political philosophy of law, is interpreted from, let's say, an Anglo-American perspective. Like Anglo people in the US and Canada tend to read Kant's political philosophy as if they could just claim Kant as one of their own, not as the way in which they are liberals, like Rawlsian type of liberalism. Then Kant is like a forerunner. So there's not much difference in the approach. And I wanted to ask you about this and how you see this way in which Kant is being read. And in particular, I mean, to put it more specifically, let's take the Enlightenment and religion. I mean, you can take it from whatever perspective you want to take it. I mean, it's up to you. But from my point of view, something that I care about is whether Kant thought that the state had a role in promoting enlightenment at a social scale. That's something that drops out from the Rawlsian type of contemporary liberalism, or Anglo-American liberalism, and whether you think that has a place on Kant's own views, and also religion, because Kant was very critical of religious practices, and this is something that contemporary Rawlsian type of liberals are very reluctant to endorse. They just want to say, no, people have very different conceptions of the good, and so they will not engage in any kind of criticism of religious practices, and whether this criticism is necessary for their political philosophy. This is something they are going to take up. So it's not clear to me how to relate, or why you think how we can relate Kant's criticism of religious practices on the one hand, and the role and whether there is a role for the state to play, or whether this criticism has some place in politics according to Kant, or is just only for the philosopher and the state has nothing to do with it. So yeah, those are my questions. But you can take it, the general question, from whatever perspective you want. Yes.
Thank you, Fabiola. These are excellent questions, and I think they are it's not so easy to respond to them. And the reason is that my impression is that Kant is not very explicit here. The problem being that, of course, Kant is a thinker of the late 18th century. And in his time, liberalism, and I think we can also see this, of course, in the classical liberal tradition, like Locke or the founding fathers of the authors of the American Constitution, and so on. The worry here very often is that the state does too much that the state somehow interferes into people's private lives and into people's free decisions. And I think, I mean, the term liberalism in the continental tradition is tied to this classical form of liberalism, where the main point is to defend people's liberties. Whereas liberalism in the Rawlsian sense, of course, is about the possibilities under which people can make a rational or reasonable use of it. And we don't find much on that second kind of liberalism in Kant, at least not very explicitly. So I think what one has to do here is then really reconstruct. So it's there's not much in Kant on these issues, like, for instance, how much should the state do in order to allow for a rational discourse in society? A question that, of course, in Kant's time was very important, a question that in our time is very important if we think of the social media. I mean, should they be regulated by the states in order to somehow fend off all kinds of disinformation and fake news and everything? Is this a task the state should take or not? And if you look for an answer in Kant's philosophy, I don't think that we find much of an explicit answer. And this may be disappointing, but I think it's just a reflection of the fact that the questions we discuss today are not the same kind of questions, or the social problems we are facing today are not the same kind of problems Kant was facing in his time. However, having said this, I think implicitly we can find many interesting points from which we can then, in a Kantian spirit, construct arguments that would answer the kinds of questions you have been raising. And in my book, of course, this is not going into much detail here, I mean, I'm not a political philosopher in my own work, so this is not something I have very much to say about. But I think, for instance, if you look at what Kant does in the essay on enlightenment, he does say officially and in the forefront, all we need is freedom of the press. So all we need is a fundamental liberty, and the state to stay out of the picture and not get involved and not have state censorship, and then everything will be fine and we'll have enlightenment and progress. But if you look more closely, you can see that Kant very well is aware of the fact that also what you need is publishers, you need authors, you need a public conversation, and Kant is aware of that. And so I think we could construct a Kantian argument here from the necessity of a public discourse to the possibilities, the conditions of the possibility of a public discourse. And if some kind of state intervention, or at least some kind of state regulation, is necessary in order to make a public discourse possible, I think then we have good Kantian reasons to make sure that these conditions are plain. And I think for this reason, so the idea would be something like a transcendental argument, right? What we do want is a functioning public discourse as the basis for political decisions and democratic vote. We need certain conditions to be in place, for instance, not only freedom of the press, but also newspapers or some kinds of means of information or means to convey information to the public that is reliable. well, if that is necessary for public discourse to function in the way we need it for democracy, then we have a good Kantian reason for the state to make sure that these conditions obtain. Sorry, is this clear enough as an answer to your question?
No, yeah, that's very helpful because, well, as you explained, and as well, like Kant's conception of the state is very different from what you were mentioning, like Locke's conception of the state. So for Kant, the state is very strong and has a very important, has a lot of competent, like tasks to fulfill. It's not a minimal state in any way. So one can say that it has a lot of regulatory tasks to perform, to carry out.
Yeah.
And you were mentioning like the conditions for a public discourse, but one can also think of education, for example.
Yeah.
Like Kant doesn't say anything about it, not specific. He's, as you say, it's very important to remember the time when he was writing. But given what he says about the economy, for example, he says a few things along those lines of this, the role of the state in regulating the economy or setting the conditions for a functioning economic relations. Then one can also maybe extend that reasoning or that argument for education. And so the state has to provide the conditions for the possibility of a public, as you were putting it. And it's not only newspapers, but also like educating the public for it. Would you agree with?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The only thing I was wondering about is, you said in Kant, there is a strong role for the state beyond the mere providing of the legal framework in which people conduct their lives. I agree with you. But my impression is that this is not very much at the surface of the text. You have to dig a little to find those passages, and you have to interpret them and to construct a little in order to arrive at that. So it's not as if Kant's account is his official and explicit account of this, for instance, in the doctrine of right, would emphasize these things very strongly. Rather, it's only in side remarks. So when it comes to the economy, for instance, there's this famous remark Kant makes, not in the doctrine of right, but in the doctrine of virtue, where he says that, well, people try to be virtuous in giving for charity, but they have to be aware of the fact that it was only good luck and bad government that makes the differences in wealth and income so strong that some people need charity and others can give it. Now, if you read these passages, you can infer from them that Kant was thinking, well, good government would be one in which people don't need charity, but rather in which social security is provided for everyone. But this is only a side remark in the doctrine of virtue, and does not occur in the official text in the doctrine of right, where he deals with the state and its tasks. So I think in the end, I completely agree with you what you're saying, but I would only want to point out that this is not something that is very much in the forefront of Kant's own thinking, and that we do have to do some interpreting here and to give Kant a helping hand, so to speak, in bring these things to the fore.
Yes, okay, thank you. No, yes, I agree with you, yes. Thank you.
So we come now to the second point in Kant's practical philosophy, where probably we will have to dig deeper into Kant's thinking, and this is the reparation of past wrongs. Fabiola,
yes. Thank you. No, yes, I was very struck when I read this passage in your book. Well, I don't have to read it like people. When you're talking about a criticism of colonialism, and then you said what Kant says they could be used to derive far-reaching claims for reparations and restitution. And I was I was very struck because I would have thought that justice for Kant is forward-looking. Not, he doesn't, as far as I know, but correct me if I'm wrong, there's no place where he makes any claims about reparations or restitutions. On the contrary, like everything he says about justice seems to be like forward-looking, in particular at the level of international relations. When he talks about peace treaty, he says, I don't remember the exact wording, but the idea is that states have to like start anew, like forget, like close all grievances, past grievances, and move on. And this is something that Arthur Ripstein, in his book on the law of war and peace, emphasizes. And also you can find it in Kant's views on revolution, like after the revolution has succeeded, then like move on, the new regime is legitimate, and people, I mean, like there's no perspective from which you can look back and fix past wrongs. So I don't know whether you agree. And also this forward-looking character of Kantian justice parallels his views on morality also, where the important thing is not for you. So the important thing for you is to know how you ought to act, what you ought to do, and move on. No, it's like improve. It's not so much about correcting what you've done wrong in the past, but try to be better. So this like forward-looking character of Kantian justice and morality seems to me, I thought was, that's the way I read it, I understand it. So how do you square this claim about reparations with this?
Yes, thank you for this very interesting question. I mean, first of all, I should say that when I say that we can find in Kant materials for an argument for wide-ranging retribution or reparation of past wrongs from colonialism, I didn't want to say that this is Kant's own view, but rather that we can find elements in Kant that one could appeal to in making such an argument. The next point is the elements I was thinking about were in particular Kant's account of property and his account of property transferal, which in the end means something like this. Property is legitimate if it can be traced back to legitimate acquisition. So that's at least part of Kant's argument. There is original acquisition of property, and if you can trace back your property to some original legitimate acquisition, then your own claim to property is legitimate. And all I was thinking was that, okay, if we agree that many cases of property acquisition through colonialism were not legitimate, then it follows that the following steps also were legitimate. Now I'm aware of the fact that Kant himself sometimes said things like, okay, but you can't dig into the past too much. And at some point you must say people own what they own, and it doesn't matter how they got it, you have to make a clean slate. So. But I think this refers only to the step from the state of nature to building a state, where you can then no longer, once you have a state, you can't go back and ask, okay, for state times, how did someone get their possession? I think once you have a state, and you can pursue back the chain of property acquisitions, Kant is committed to the claim, if there was one bad link in it, then your present claim is no longer, at least no longer uncontested. So that was the idea I was working with. So I would say that we could argue, based on some Kantian ideas, that claims to property people now have that go back to illegal acquisition through colonialism, they are at least contestable, and they should make us rethink whether we have to do some kind of reparation. Now, you say, doesn't this conflict with Kant's generally forward-looking perspective on justice? And I want to say, yes, Kant is often forward-looking, but there's one big exception, and that is his theory of punishment, which, even though it may not be as retributivist as it looks, has one very central element for retribution. Namely, Kant says that you have to take on in. So, if someone has killed, they have to be killed. If someone has stolen, they have to give back the property and make compensations. Now, I'm not want to defend Kant's view here, and it's complicated and it's difficult to interpret. But all I wanted to point out here is that Kant is not always forward-looking when it comes to justice. He's also sometimes backward-looking, and so I don't think that this is not in keeping. What I've been saying is not in keeping with Kantian principles.
But in what you're saying about punishment, like a bigger symmetry there, is that in the case of punishment, as you explain, like Kant uses this as a criterion for the kind of punishment. Yes. And there is an authority in charge of deciding this. Whereas in the case of colonialism, it's not a criterion for something else, like looking back to what happened. So in the case of punishment, it's backward looking in the sense that we need a criterion for determining the adequate punishment for the crime. And there's an authority to do that. And in the case of colonialism, we don't have an authority to determine this. So it's completely indeterminate. Who is going to say what was illegally taken from whom, from which perspective? And that's one difficulty. So there's the asymmetry breaks down. Yeah. And also, this, in the case of colonialism, you don't need a criterion for something else, like in the case of punishment. You need to look back in order, as a criterion for punishment, but not in the case of colonialism. So I would think that the analogy is not, it's not completely satisfactory, yes.
Okay, but so what about this? One might try to turn this argument around and argue as follows. Okay, you are completely right, and I think it's an important point, that we don't have any authority to decide what were the wrongs done by colonialism and what would be adequate ways of compensation. And this is in analogy to Kant's argument for moving from the state of nature to a civil state, is an argument for having international courts that can adjudicate these kinds of issues. I mean, I think one thing is very obvious. Great wrongs have been done by colonialism, and many people today still profit from those wrongs, and other people suffer from those wrongs. I think this is very hard to deny. But if that is true, you might argue, not from in Kant's own words, but in Kantian spirit, so to speak, that something has to be done about this injustice. And since within the society itself that is concerned, it is not possible to come to have an authority that is neutral, what we need is international courts of justice who help in this kind of situation by trying to hear both sides and trying to find a just solution for these kinds of problems. And I think that would be a possible way forward. I mean, obviously, when the United States today debate the issue of how much compensation would be adequate, and there are some people who say almost nothing, and other people say like 300 billion or something, or incredible numbers. Well, of course, the people who discuss these issues, they are not impartial. And so Kant's main point about the uncertainty and indeterminacy of many legal issues is that because of that, we need courts. And maybe the same thing goes here.
Yes, I agree with that. But what, like I cite, if we think of like Kantian or Kant's conception of justice or Kant's views of justice as forward-looking, I mean, if we think of it in that way, I want to say that I prefer that view. I think that correcting past wrongs, I mean, I'm not going to deny the ills and wrongs of colonialism. And of course, you're right that people continue profiting from past wrongs. I mean, of course, but the question is how to address, I mean, if the question is how to address injustice today, like I go with Kant, if we take him as a forward-looking view of justice, that there's a lot to be done to correct injustice looking to the future. So to correct injustice now, and forget about past wrongs. The past is gone, and yes, of course, but there's a lot to be done, like with immigration, for example, or with debt today. So I think that the forward-looking view of justice is just very powerful, it seems to me. And there are good reasons to recommend it, and doesn't have the additional difficulties that correcting past wrongs have, it seems to me. But anyway, that's
yeah,
just my personal.
I understand your point, and I also, of course, see the difficulties that come with trying to correct past wrongs on this historical and this level. It's almost impossible. What I like about that perspective is that it somehow is able to undermine the sense many people seem to have, many people who still profit today from colonialism and its wrongs, that somehow what they now have is really theirs, and they have a legitimate claim to it. And therefore they argue from a position of superiority. And I think that's not correct. I think people have to be aware of the fact, people in the global north, that many of the privileges we possess are not earned by our own fair work or fair dealings, but are based on criminal acts, or acts that were not legally correct. And so maybe a compromise here would be to say, yes, we have to think about the future, but in doing so, we have to be aware of the fact where our own relative positions in society come from historically. And we shouldn't leave that out of the picture.
Yes, fine. I think that was a very good compromise in the end. In order to do something forward-looking, we also have to do something backward-looking. So, Marcus, this has been a very long discussion, and I want to ask you, are you open for the last two questions?
Oh, yes, I am. Yes.
Okay, because these are about philosophy of nature or theoretical philosophy, and I'll try to make them short. There is a passage on page 252 to 53 where you refer to the gap between the a priori laws of nature and the particular laws of nature, and you refer to this gap in two ways. And I wanted to ask you if these two ways are two ways of reading Kant today, or two ways in which Kant himself refers to this gap, because they seem to be very different. And one is saying that maybe the laws of nature are chaotic and there are no regularities, despite the fact that we have this general causal law. Maybe when we look at particular sequences, we will not be able to find the particular laws, and that would be the second way of referring to it, because it's more like we are not able, even though they are there. But the first way is like maybe they are not there because nature is chaotic. So how do you think these two readings are Kant's in Kant himself, or these are two different ways of reading Kant?
Yes, I mean, I think that these two views are compatible in the following way. Given Kant's transcendental philosophy and the fundamental role the principle of causality plays in nature, there are two worries one might still have. So we do know from the critique of pure reason, if we believe Kant's argument there, that nature must have a causal structure, that things do not happen just by chance, but everything that happens has a cause. And if something happens from a cause, this means that there is a law of nature somewhere in the book. But now there are two possibilities here. One is, and that's A, that laws of nature are very, very fine-grained. And perhaps also natural kinds are very fine-grained. So that basically this glass here and the glass in my glasses here, even though they are both made from glass, the laws of nature that hold for them are different. And the same again for this glass and glass that looks very similar. So it might be the case that even though there is regularity in nature, it's only on the one hand, a very, very general level, everything that happens has a cause. And on the other hand, on an extremely particular level, so that for glasses that for us are indiscernible, different laws of nature hold. And this would make it extremely difficult for us to find these laws of nature. But even if that is not the case, and we don't know this, if we only look at Kant's argument for transcendental philosophy, it may still be that there are laws of nature, but they are so complicated that we can't find them. So I think both is possible. Both are possibilities that are not ruled out by Kant's argument in the Principles chapter of the first critique. And so you are right, maybe I'm not very clear in distinguishing them, but I think that they are both relevant for Kant's concern, and that so my hunch is that in the critique of the power of judgment, Kant is more concerned with the second possibility, and in the opus posthumum, he's more concerned with the first possibility. But now, yeah, please.
When you say chaotic, then you don't mean that there are no regularities, but that they are maybe at a very, very particular fine-grained level that we will not be able to discern. So this seems to be the second possibility, that although the laws are there, we will not be able to find them. And when we find some laws, maybe they apply on a certain level, but when we go down more, they don't apply anymore.
Yeah.
But in the end, every particular event must be, governed by a law. And so all comes down to the second possibility. And the problem, because I know, as you say in the book, Kant was really worried with this problem into his old age. In the Opus Posthumum, it was mainly maybe about this gap. So maybe we should read him as saying that the particularity may be so fine-grained that we will not be able to find all the laws, but not maybe in the sense that there are no laws, because it doesn't seem to be compatible to say both things.
Well, I mean, for the first possibility that there are only, so I think you're right. For Kant, there have to be laws of nature. And so what I meant by the first possibility is that these are so fine-grained that they are hard to find, but that doesn't imply that we can't find them. It means it's difficult to find them, but perhaps we can find them, perhaps we can't. And this is why I think that the two possibilities should be distinguished. And there's another reason why they should be distinguished, because even if it was not the case that laws of nature are very specific, rather, I mean, perhaps we find them in Newtonian physics and in genetics and in chemistry and everywhere. And so we have all these wonderful laws of nature. It's still possible that there are also laws of nature we cannot find. And that's, of course, Kant's view about organisms, where he thinks that the causal laws that would explain the generation of the coming to be of organisms, they are epistemically inaccessible to us. And not because they are too fine-grained or too complicated, but because of the way our minds work and because of the way organisms are structured. And these two things, unfortunately for Kant, they don't fit together because organisms are structured holistically, but our ways of explaining things are bottom up or top down, but never holistic. And so, according to Kant, there is a reason for the second possibility that is independent from the first possibility. So even if there are wonderful laws of nature we can discover, there still is one phenomenon in nature, namely organisms, for which we can never find the laws of nature that explain them, according to Kant. And so I think it's important to keep these two possibilities distinct.
Thank you, and that takes us to the last question about organisms. And what I wanted to point out is that in this chapter about teleology, you place the emphasis on the explanation of the functioning of organisms, of the laws that explain how organisms work. But there is, I think, a different interest in Kant that has to do with the origin of organisms, in a sense, the origin of the first organism from inert matter, from raw matter, as he says in some passages. So raw matter is dead matter, it's not living matter. But if organisms are matter, just matter, there must be some transition, and I think Kant considers this as real, that there must be some transition between raw matter and organisms, because if not, he would have to say God created organisms from matter, and he doesn't want to say that. He wants to give matter some credit. But he denies completely the possibility that we will understand this transition. And there's this famous passage on the Newton that would the Newton-like scientists that would explain the origin, the generation of the blade of grass, standing for the simplest organism that Kant could think about then, because microorganisms had not been discovered as far as I know. But I mean, Kant was very insightful in seeing that to explain the passage from raw matter to an organism would be like explaining the emergence of teleology within matter. And that is something that, for example, Descartes had no idea about. He was confident that this transition would be explained by science, but he never saw the hard problem of life, and that is, how can life emerge from inert matter, that just works by the laws of mechanics, of Newton, and mechanical laws, efficient causes. How can that explain the origin of teleology? And I think this is a very interesting point, because it shows Kant was really very insightful on the problem of the origin of organisms. It's a very hard problem for scientists as well, although every scientist believes science will crack it in the end. But, there is a hard problem there. So I just wanted to point out that you don't mention it, and maybe it would be nice to mention it if there's a future edition of the book.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the suggestion.
The motto of this chapter is about paragraph 8.
From that passage, and I don't go much into that later. You're absolutely right. And I agree with you. The Kant here, as in so many other places, is extremely insightful. And he has this fantastic sense of what the real problem is. It's really amazing. And maybe Kant even has a point here that is still valid today, namely, we know that there must be some kind of transition between inorganic and organic matter. And perhaps, as I just very briefly indicated before, perhaps there is a constitutional reason why we will never have an explanation of that transition that is satisfactory to us. Because it is a kind of explanation our minds are just not made for. As Kant thinks that the only kind of mind that would understand this kind of transition would be an intuitive intellect, one that does not work stepwise by adding cause to cause and then explaining a phenomenon, but rather that takes in the phenomenon with all its causal background, so to speak, at a glance. And our minds are not working that way. And of course, as you already, I think, as you also said, Alejandro, the emergence of so-called emergent properties, whether this is life, whether this is consciousness, whether this is something very simple like the different aggregate states, like, why is it that water comes in 3 kinds of aggregate states, namely fluid, ice, and what's it? Not fog. sorry, vapor, thank you. As far as I know, there are still no satisfactory explanations of these things. And maybe Kant has a point here that this has to do with the way our minds work. So that would be one possible reason why we cannot so easily come up with explanations. Yeah, but I very much welcome your suggestion. Thank you.
Well, so if nobody else has an additional point to discuss, we already have had Marcus here for almost 2 hours and a half. I would like to thank you all, and very especially Marcus, for accepting the invitation and discussing with us this very interesting book on Kant. I hope really it will enjoy very future editions, so that future generations can also profit from reading it and learning about Kant's thought and his life. And of course, also we didn't talk about the myths about Kant's life, but the myths you try to debunk, and I think it's very important also to see philosophers in a real historical perspective that is compatible with the real facts of his life. So thank you very much again. We enjoyed
I would like to thank you. Thank you very much for your serious reading of my book and your very helpful and interesting questions, and for a very interesting and lively discussion. This was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and congratulations.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Alejandro for organizing this.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation, for bringing us together. And say hi to Gonzalo.
Hi, Fabiola. Hi. I thank you for your presentation, your attention, and for the commitment to do this kind of things. I think we have to repeat this kind of events, the presentation of relevant books. Thank you very much for all that. And
yes, thank you. There are many topics of which we could still discuss.
Lots of things, yes.
Well, congratulations once again, Marcus.
We also thank Robert and the organizers.
Have a great day in your part of the world. Our day is already ending, so enjoy the hopefully nice fall weather, and take care, everyone.
Good night.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, organizers.
Bye, Fabiola. Bye, Pedro.